Quinnipium, welcome to our Knowing Nipmuc webinar series. We hope that this collection of educational webinars will allow organizations to know Nipmuc better and to facilitate greater understanding between our cultures. Thank you so much for viewing. Hey, let's get started. All right, so welcome. This is Nipmuc History Part 1, from contact period a little before to the end of the 19th century or the 1800s. So pre-contact. The pre-contact means before, this is Europeans, but really before the English settled these shores. And this map shows a little bit about how the indigenous nations existed or their homelands before the English got here. It's not completely accurate. It's not something you could take, you can take with a grain of salt because it's not really accurate. I mean, there really weren't any lines or state lines or anything like that before the English arrived. So Nipmuc means freshwater people, and the English referred to the land that we occupied as Nipnet. And that referred to all Indians living inland, which consisted of several bands of related people with kinship ties and common planting, hunting, and fishing grounds. So that would be Hassanamisic, Quabogs, Nashobas, Nashaways, Chibanagungamog, all of those folks. So the general boundaries were to like the New Hampshire and Vermont border in the Merrimack Valley. To the south would be like Toland and Windham County, and the northwest corner of Providence County in Rhode Island, like where Burrowville and Cumberland and Lincoln and all of those towns there. The east includes the Natick and Sudbury area, but after that, it's pretty much the Massachusetts tribe. And then west, pretty much to the Connecticut River. I will say that the most southern bands of Nipmuc paid tribute to either the Mohegan tribe or the Narragansett tribe, which were larger and more centrally organized groups. The north and west Nipmuc bands were often raided by Mohawks. So our pre-contact culture, our ancestors spoke, and what we teach our people today is a combination of N&L dialect Algonquin. And most of the tribes on the East Coast spoke some dialect of Algonquin. We lived in separate yet interconnected villages or bands dispersed throughout our homeland area. And we had seasonal cycles of economic activity. And what I mean by that is that indigenous land use is based on the principles of sustainability and stewardship. So focusing on a kinship-based relationship with the land. Many indigenous people, including Nipmucs, view land as a living being and believe that all activities on the land are connected to our cultural and spiritual belief. Indigenous-centered land management developed over thousands of years and was shaped by a deep knowledge of the local environment. This deep knowledge allows our people to adapt to changing conditions like the current climate changes we're experiencing today. So most people, when you hear about seasonal cycles of economic activity, you'll read in the history books how we were like nomads wandering from here to there. And it wasn't that. It was planned activities designed to be in balance with the earth itself. And in this corner here, this pipe, that's a pipe that's being held right now by the Ecotarium in Worcester. We hope to have it repatriated to us. This is just a drawing made by a man called Everett Jacobs that we had colorized that they use for kids, but it shows a typical village, woodland village, before the English arrived. And this is another picture that shows a larger, much larger Eastern Algonquin village. So the contact period. This is when the English arrived. Of course, before the English got here, we had interactions with, some say the French, some say Vikings, possibly both. And because we had no natural immunity against diseases such as smallpox, there were deadly epidemics. They say that there's a possibility of 80% mortality rate before the Pilgrims and the Puritans even arrived. And of course, when the Pilgrims and Puritans arrived, they see cleared lands and even corn growing, and they took that as, God wanted them to be here. It's estimated that there were only 5,000 to 6,000 Nipmucs left when the English arrived. So at the time the English came, our centers of population were mainly like along the Blackstone, the Quabog, the Nashua, and the Quinebaug rivers, like in Connecticut. The earliest known contact in record between Nipmucs and the English was probably in 1621 in Stirling, where Nashawaanan was sachem. So around 1640, so the English came here, 1621 to 1628. So this is not even 20 years later. Reverend John Eliot of Roxbury began preaching to the natives in 1640s. And between 1650 and 1675, just before King Philip's War, he established 14 praying villages, most of them in Nipmuc territory, but there were also ones in Massachusetts and Wampanoag areas. They were set up to, convert the savages, because that's what they thought we were, and allow us to emulate the English. Native practices were not allowed within these plantations or praying towns, but Nipmucs practiced traditional ways anyway. And the way we know that is by grave goods. So I'm sure you guys are all aware of the practices of digging up native remains and putting them in museums or boxes or however, but the grave goods that came with those remains allow us to see exactly what our ancestors did. So natives from all over joined these towns, not just Nipmucs, but people from all over. For Nipmucs, one of the reasons for joining the town to help them protect from Mohawks and other more powerful tribes. Some of the praying towns, Manchog, Chabanagungumok, Maniacs, Quisesset, Wabaquisset, Pacachog, Wyantung, those translate to Sutton, Webster, Thompson, Connecticut, Pomfret, Connecticut, Woodstock, Connecticut, Auburn, Mass, and Uxbridge, Mass. And of course, Hassanamissa and Natick are on there as well. Oh, my thing is stuck. There we go. So King Philip's War. I'm not going to talk a lot about King Philip's War. There are so many books written about this pivotal moment in our history, because Nipmuc culture and Nipmuc people and all the other cultures in southern New England and northern New England as well were never the same after this war. So basically, King Philip's War started in about April of 1675 when John Sassamon, who was a Wampanoag, was murdered, but he was an informer for the English. He had gone to the English to tell them that Philip, who was a Wampanoag sachem at that time, was planning on fighting back, because at first we welcomed the English, right? We welcomed them. This is the kind of people we were. We welcomed them into our homes. We allowed them to live on our land. We didn't understand that the culture that they had, that they came here because they thought that they could have the land. And we didn't really quite understand that. But by 1675, of course, it's clear that they meant to supplant us for real. So Philip was blamed for this, even though he was within his right as a sachem to execute traitors. And John Sassamon, being Wampanoag and informing on his sachem, would cause him to be a traitor. So the English attempted to arrest Philip, but he escaped to Pocasset and his sister-in-law, Weetamong. And this is a map, comes from, I want to say, I won't say, it's one of the King Philip War books that was published back in the 1990s. So I'm just going to say a little bit about what happened. So the praying Indians, including Hassanamissa, fought and scouted for the English in the beginning. In July of 1675, the Mohegans traveled to Boston and pledged their support for the English. The Hassanamissites also pledged their support to stay out of the war, not necessarily for the English, but to stay out of the war. In August 30th of 1675, the Massachusetts Bay government decides to confine all Indians to only 5 plantations: Natick, Punkapog, Neshoba, Wamisit, which is now Lowell, and Hassanamissa. Indians found outside these limits were subject to jail or death. They are unable to hunt, harvest, or trade. So they're telling us we cannot be in our own lands, that we cannot hunt, we cannot fish, we cannot go outside the limits that they've placed in our own land. Under false pretenses, the praying Indians at Marlborough were seized and jailed. Most were later released, but some were either shot as traitors to the English or others were sold into slavery. English soldiers were sent into Nipmuc country to find and destroy supplies and villages of the Nipmuc, I call them freedom fighters, but instead destroyed the praying Indians' belongings and their stock. Murmuring against the praying Indians by the English continued, so that the government forcibly removes 200 residents of Natick. These are people who are siding with the English. They removed them to Deer Island in the middle of the night. In November of 1675, Hassanamisco residents decided to go with the Nipmuc warriors. If you go to the up on Deer Island. So prior to the King Philip's War and what led Philip to take the stand that he did, that there were other things happening. I mean, again, Nipmucs were being arrested for going into lands that they've been going into for hundreds of years, arrested for trespassing. They were being enslaved. Some were being sold actually down to the Caribbean. They were being forcibly indentured. So their whole livelihoods were changing. And this is to stop that. Deer Island is a very important part of this whole war. We already said that the natives were taken away forcibly and without warning. So while we sit, they're asking the Massachusetts authorities for protection from the Nipmuc warriors. And as a reward, they're sent to Deer Island as well. The Neshoba Indians, not too far from where I live in Worcester, sent to Deer Island. And all of those praying Indians that fought with the English against Philip are eventually sent to Boston Harbor before the end of the war. In May of 1676, after King Philip's War was over, they were all released from the islands, but most of them had perished. This is a picture, I think, taken in 2017 of some indigenous folks that are getting ready to cross Boston Harbor and go up the Charles River in the opposite direction of how the Natick people were taken forcibly and taken down the Charles and across Boston Harbor to Deer Island. This is a yearly ritual. So post King Philip's War. So we're just not the same after King Philip's War. The Nipmuc population is sharply decreased due to death by war, death by execution after the war for any male or female that was found to be complicit in the fight, death by enslavement. People were enslaved out of Massachusetts Bay and sent to the Caribbean. There were children and women who were forced indentured in major cities such as Providence, Boston, Salem. And then the English started to move in because there's no people there anymore to prevent it already living there. So they began permanent settlements in Nipmuc country. And then Nipmuc refugees were allowed at one point to resettle Hassanamisset, Natick, Chibunagungumog, and Wabaquasit, which would be Woodstock, Connecticut. So I want to talk about a couple of, I guess, well-known Nipmucs that were alive in the 17th century, the 1600s. One is James the Printer, and he was born Wabawas at Hassanamisset in around 1640. At age 5, he was sent to live in an English household. So that's kind of a twofold thing. In indigenous culture at that time, sending a child to live with allies was an act of diplomacy. The child would learn the culture and the practice of the other community and bring that knowledge and understanding back to his own people. Now, the English may have had other reasons for removing young children from their families and placing them with English families. In an English home, indigenous children were more easily indoctrinated into Christianity. And by keeping the children of indigenous leaders isolated in English towns, the threat of violence or resistance by Nipmucs would be reduced. So, like holding your children hostage. So James the Printer, at age 5, he goes to an English household. He attended the Indian Charity School at Harvard College. And in his late teens, he caught the eye of John Eliot. So Eliot thought that printing a Bible in the local language would help his mission. And his mission, again, was to Christianize all of the savages or Indians. He made efforts to learn the language. He secured indigenous youth to help in the translating. But the printing press at Harvard College was the only press available. And the 2 English printers running the press didn't know the local language. And Eliot felt it would take way too long for the English printers to typeset the translated Bible. He needed someone indigenous who was fluent in English. And he found James the Printer. And James became an apprentice in that printing shop at Harvard. He helped to translate and then typeset the first Bible published in the Western Hemisphere. Later in life, James was also active in King Philip's War. He, at first, like other Hasidists, cleared himself neutral. He didn't fight for either side. They were just going to be neutral, staying in that praying plantation. But eventually it didn't work, right? Because the English were taking those neutral Indians and bringing them to Deer Island or selling them into slavery. So James and the other Hasidists eventually went with the warrior Nipmucs, and at Minamisit, he became a scribe for the leadership there. And he wrote a couple of letters to the English authorities to say, the first one says, you started this, right? You started this. We're only defending our home. The second letter was more a negotiation tool for, and I'm sure you guys have heard of Mary Rawlinson and how she was kidnapped by the Nipmucs and forced to be Weedamo's servant and taken all through the war. And that was the second letter that James Printer wrote for the Nipmuc leadership, was a negotiation letter to release Mary Rawlinson. So James the Printer, after the war, he goes back to the press and he prints out more books and pamphlets and things like that in the Nipmuc language, or in the Massachusetts language, I should say. And then after that, he starts to teach at Hasidic. He retired back home. In 1709, though, he dies fighting for the English in Queen Anne's War, which is one of the French and Indian Wars, one of the first ones. So he didn't give up on his, I guess, loyalty to the English. Another person who's like almost the exact opposite of James the Printer is John Wampus. John was born around the same time at Hasidic. His family moved to Nonantum as a child. So Nonantum was a Christianized village that's near where Newton is now. And so he grew up as a Christian, or Christianized Indian, John Wampus. Around the age of 10, his father sent him to live with an English family in Roxbury, and he attended Roxbury Grammar School. He then goes on to attend Harvard College with other Native students, but he didn't really like it, so he left for life at sea. Eventually, he marries a formerly enslaved Pequot woman named Anne Trask, and he becomes a land trader. This is why John Wampus is just such a, see the picture here, the book, Swindler's Sachem, written by Jenny Hale Pulsifer. It's all about John Wampus. So he becomes a land trader. He pretends to represent the Nipmuc people, and he sold multiple parcels of land as the Sachem. And just before the start of the King's Philip War, the true Nipmuc leadership, they complained to Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're like, this man, he doesn't represent us, but he's going around and everybody believes him, and he's selling all these parcels of land, and we're still living on these lands. So just before the start of King Philip's War, John sort of escapes. He goes to England. He's hoping for a letter from the actual king to counter these claims of the Nipmuc leadership. So he spends all of King Philip's War over there in England. I'm not really sure how he managed to get a letter from the king, but he did. And he sails back to Massachusetts. He gives a letter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they're like, we don't really care. And they send him to a new Indian court with Daniel Gookin presiding. Now, Daniel Gookin was the Indian commissioner at that time. And Daniel Gookin says, I'm sorry, but the Nipmuc leadership here, who came forth again, who was left, I should say, says you do not represent them. You're not a sachem. You have no right to sell this land. And so you would think that was that, but John didn't take no for answer. He continued to illegally sell land this time, and people are still buying it, not caring that not only the Nipmuc leadership, but the Massachusetts government is saying this man does not represent Nipmuc people, don't buy from him. They don't care, they just do it anyway. And just when he was going to get caught again, he returned to England by boat, where he died all by himself in 1679. The only good thing out of this was that he wrote a will before he died, leaving Hassanaமிska or Hassanamisset to the Hassanaமிsko people. And because English law is what it is, that will just confounded people and confused people. But if you'll see in the next century, it actually worked to our benefit, this will. So the 18th century was not a great century for Nipmuc people. All Native peoples in the Commonwealth, including Nipmucs, had guardians or trustees appointed by the Massachusetts Bay colony or the government to oversee the indigenous people, because we're unable to oversee ourselves. Legally, Nipmucs could not buy or sell their land without the guardians requesting permission from the MA legislature. So if you wanted to sell your land, or if you wanted to lease it to someone, you had to go to the guardian, and the guardian would write a petition, and the petition would go to legislature, and they would decide, and then they would go back to the guardian and then back to you. In practice, though, the guardian sold land at will to pay their debts and the Nipmuc's debts sometimes, but mostly to pay their own debts. Nipmuc children were still being taken from their homes and placed in white homes as indentured servants during this time. Monies from the sales of these lands were placed into trust. Individual Nipmucs were able to petition the court to sell or receive their shares if they were able to write. During this period of time, the greatest loss of Indian lands occurred. I mean, it just flew out of our hands completely. The sale of Hassanamisset was one of those big land sales. Between 1727 and 1728, 40 English proprietors bought 7,500 of the 8,000 acres of Hassanamisset. Only 7 Nipmuc families were able to keep some land, dividing between them the remaining 500 acres. The monies from the sale were placed in trust, and the interest was supposed to be paid to the families yearly. The principal was never paid out and was lost to time. Some of the principal was actually lost when guardians or the trustees would take the money out to use to pay their own debts. And that's documented in the Earl papers. Many times the annuities were not paid out, and the Indians themselves had to go and write to the legislature saying the trustees are not paying us, we're not getting any money for them. And it happened over and over and over again. So Joseph Aaron is one of the more, I don't want to say famous, but someone we know more than others in this century, in the 18th century. He was born in Providence in 1738 to Sarah Muckamog and Aaron Whipple. And he spent much of his childhood as an indentured child or traveling back and forth between Providence and Hassanamisset. Now, his family is one of the 7 families that were allotted land at Hassanamisset in 1727. He's a descendant of Robin Pettivitt, who was a leader of Hassanamisko and who died just before King Philip's War. His mother, Sarah Muckamog, was a 2nd-generation indentured woman. Her mother, Sarah Robbins, was indentured in Providence as a child as a result of the end of King Philip's War and all Native people having to report to a certain place or be hunted down. So Sarah Muckamog grew up as an indentured servant, and she had a child, or she had 4 children actually, with Aaron Whippet, who was enslaved by Colonel Joseph Whipple in Providence. So as a young adult, Joseph Aaron, despite being the child of an indentured servant and an enslaved man, he served in the French and Indian War. He also served in the Revolutionary War, which he was injured and became unable to do is what he used to do. He spent a lot of time as a ship's crewman, most likely sailing out of Providence. At one point, he got into a dispute with his sister over land at Hassanamisco. So up to this point, the allotted land had passed from mother to daughter. And the land at Hassanamisco had passed to his half-sister, Sarah Burney. And he didn't like that. He wanted half the land. He felt he deserved it. His other siblings were still living in Providence as indentured servants, and it was only him and Sarah at Hassanamisco. And so after a very protracted battle, he did receive half the land, but then he sold it all before his death in 1808. And his last 43 acres were sold to a white landowner who also received interest payments from the Hassanamisco Fund for caring for Joseph and his wife in his last years. So it's like, for me, that's like adding insult to injury, right? Not only are you getting the land, but you're getting the interest payments that are for Indigenous people. So, yeah, so Joseph Aaron, but all he did with his life, he just ended up poor and without anything. Joseph Piegan, he's a Piegan Indian. He was born at Chibunagungumog around 1756, part of the Piegan band of Nipmuc Indians that occupied land that's now called Webster and Dudley, Massachusetts. And many Piegans also owned land at Natick after Kingsfield War. He served in Revolutionary War for 3 years, from 1777 to 1780, and he died in 1818, shortly after his pension payments commenced. I think he had like 6 or 7 months worth of pension payments, and then he died. He's notable in our community not only for his service, but for those that claim descent from him. So many families claim descent from Joseph Piegan. So moving on to the 19th century, the 1800s, land loss, it just continues unabated. I mean, the land is just flying out of Nipmuc hands. It's because they can't work. I mean, who's going to hire a Nipmuc person to work in your store? There's no factories or anything like that. Most Nipmucs are going around, making baskets or caning chairs, but it's not really enough, to feed your family and go. So they're selling their land in order to pay their debts. And some of those debts are debts that are created. Like the trustees would take an elderly person or a sick person from their home, from their family, place them into an English family's home, and then charge that Nipmuc person for that English family taking care of them. And that was the way to put that Nipmuc family into debt. And then you'd have to sell land to pay that debt. So it was all just I don't say a game, but it just wasn't legal or moral, I should say. So anyway, land loss continues unabated in the 1800s. Several Nipmucs from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut served in the Union Army during the Civil War for both the 54th and the 55th Massachusetts regiments, which I think most of us know are colored units. The Industrial Revolution caused many Nipmuc families to move up or down river to Worcester. That's because it's work, right? You don't have to make baskets and cane chairs. It's actual work that you can get paid and you can take care of your families. So they moved to cities to find this work and to find mates as well. Many were shoemakers before and after the shoe factories were built. In the Worcester area, there were shoe factories everywhere. Some married African Americans, some married whites, but still there's multiple intermarriages between Natick, Dudley, Hassanamisco, and Woodstock, which is why today almost all Nipmucs are cousins to each other. We maintained our kinship tribes. The people from Hassanamisco and Woodstock, Connecticut still receive their annuities from the government. I have established Nipmuc enclaves in Worcester, but I think that's a mistake. I think that didn't happen until the 20th century. But most Nipmucs in Worcester at this time lived around where downtown is right now, or where John Street Church is right now. Unfortunately, we're still considered wards of the state for the first part of this 19th century. But then along comes the Massachusetts Enfranchisement Act. In June of 1869, Indians and people of color, heretofore known and called Indians, become citizens of Massachusetts. And then that throws lands open for sale to non-Indigenous people. Lands held in common, like in Dudley, were sold and the proceeds divided up amongst the Piegan Indians. Aid to natives through normal welfare channels instead of through the legislature. There was no more going to your guardians and then the guardians going to the legislature. You could just go to the poorhouse. How nice. So Massachusetts tried to follow a Reconstruction era federal racial policy, deciding since there were little pure-blooded Indians left, and since the state had always, or at least since 1790, been committed to freedom for African Americans, why not the Indians? So the citizenship in Massachusetts, everybody who's native becomes a citizen in 1869. And that paved the way for sale of the remaining Nipmuc lands. In 1871, the last Dudley land was sold off, and the 5 remaining families that lived on that land were put into a house on Lake Street, and the rest scattered to other Nipmucs living in Worcester, Providence, Woodstock, and of course, Hassanemisco. In 1886, there was a Dudley court case because they didn't get paid in 1871 for the land that was sold. So the living members of the Piegan Band of Nipmucs were given a share from the proceeds of the sale of their reservation, which came to $61.61 apiece. Nipmuc activities became centered at Hassanemisco. That was the last unsold piece of Nipmuc land. So Sarah Boston, in the 1800s, Sarah Boston was a famous figure in the histories of Grafton, the history of surrounding towns like Westboro, Marlborough. She was the last of her family line to live on the land allotted in 1727. She was born around 1787 and she died in 1837. Archaeological studies that have been completed over the last 10 or 15 years seem to show that her homestead, was the center of the Nipmuc community while it was there. Her ancestor was Robin Pettivitt, again, a leader of Hassanemisco from back before King Philip's War. She's actually the niece of Joseph Aaron. And like many, she made baskets and cane chairs to make ends meet. And of course, she sold her land. When her daughter sold the last of her land in 1857, leadership responsibilities shifted to the Printer family. And this little picture here, I think that's a picture by Harriet Merrifield Forbes, and it shows Sarah Boston's house. So this is Sarah Maria Arnold. And this picture here is definitely drawn by Harriet Merrifield Forbes, showing the homestead as we call it today. So Sarah Maria Arnold was born at Hassanemisc in 1818, daughter of Harry Arnold and Lucy Gimby. Now, Lucy Gimby was descended from the Moses Printer line, one of the original 7 families that were allotted land, and lived on that family's last parcel of land. The current homestead on the reservation today was built for Lucy in 1802. Sarah Maria Arnold, Lucy's granddaughter, married Narragansett Samuel Cisco, which is why the picture there says Cisco House. And when we refer to that family today, we call them the Ciscos. Her father and uncle, John Hector, inherited the last of the Printer land when Lucy died. John Hector sold his half and bought a home in Worcester. After her father died in 1851, Sarah Maria Arnold becomes the matriarch of her family. And when that homestead became the very last piece of unsold Nipmuc land, she ensured that it would never be sold. And she passed that determination on to her son and her grandchildren. So Sarah wrote several letters. They were letter writers. I mean, there's like boxes of them. And a lot of these letters were to her sisters and her cousins and her children. And for a long time, the letters were lost, for 30 years, actually. A researcher that worked with Zara Cisco Bro, who would be Sarah's great-granddaughter, took the letters with him to Switzerland and didn't return them for like 30 years. So we recently we tried having them scanned, it didn't work well. We recently had photographs taken of them at Brown University's library. And the letters are mostly like from 1884 to 1886. And they talk about other Nipmuc people. They talk about everyday things, like what something costs and what they did that day and what they plan to do. But they also talk about things like election day and the election cake and tribal issues that are very valuable to us, that they were talking about these things in the 1880s. So at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, the leadership is firmly in the hands of the Printo-Cisco family because it's the only land left, right? There's no more land at Dudley. There's no more land at Wabaquasit. There's no more land at Natick. It's only here at Hassanamisset, and it's only the Printer family's parcel that's left. So eventually that land becomes known as the reservation as it is today. And all Nipmucs are gathering there. We have documentation of the Webster Dudley folks coming over. And Nipmucs is starting to organize and determined to not be erased, to not let that last piece of land go, to not let our culture leave. And that's it for today. I think the part 2 will be sometime in August, but do you guys have questions? I don't think, is Erica there?
Yep, I'm here. I don't see any questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
Hi.
It's
Heidi
not my
Freeman.
machine.
Hi, Heidi Freeman. Thank you for the presentation. It was really great. Thank you so much for the education and the history. Will these slides be shared with people?
Yes, so Knowing Nipmuc is a 7-part webinar series. It's really basically for organizations to know more about us, but for our people as well. So yeah, so they're all recorded and they will be on file on our website at nipmucband.org. And the recordings will be right there. It takes a couple of days to get it up, but so there's one there now. This is the second webinar. There's one there now, and this will be put there in a couple of days.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Hey, Cheryl, this is Scott Foster. Great presentation. I really enjoyed the information that you shared. I wish that this could be rolled out into the community and teach the non-natives of the history of our history so that they can get it straight and understand what our people have gone through, because they have no idea.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, this will be on the website for anybody to access.
Great job.
Any other questions? Any history questions? No?
I have a question, Emily, sorry. I have a question about the item that the Ecotarium has. How many other items are museums holding hostage that should be repatriated? And is there work that the community could do that would support the Nipmuc Nation in getting those back?
Yeah, so I mean, museums all over the place have ancestors. They have items that we would like returned. So the Ecotarium did return an ancestor recently. They do not have any others that I know of that are Nipmuc, at least. And the 3 pipes, we've asked about the 3 pipes, and we're working with them about that. But yeah, there's plenty of museums and things, and maybe if Ray's here, she could speak to this better. But there's plenty of museums out there who don't want to return anything and fight like heck, like Harvard Peabody, for instance, to not return anything.
I didn't mean to imply that I thought that no other place was holding items.
Are you thinking about
illegally.
Ecotarium only?
Well, no. I guess I was like wondering. I think it's important to, of course, to have allies and for other people to do some of the, letter writing, phone calling, etc. And I was wondering if you needed activism in that area or not.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So there's a institution in Worcester who we know has Nipmuc remains, and they haven't even reached out to us. They know that we know. We told them that we know, and they haven't even done that very first step of reaching out, and that's right here in Worcester. So yeah, I mean, contact us. We could use all the help we can get, because
Sure.
I mean, it's a federal law. And I think that actually on August 1st, we're gonna Ray Gold, Dr. Ray Gold is gonna do a NAGPRA and repatriation presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, because I should look at the chat.
Hi, Cheryl. This is Jenny Burton. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask more about how you're using the land on the reservation these days, and what kind of activities go on there.
So there, well, when we were pretty much closed down for COVID, but so we usually have socials. We usually have ceremony. We have a powwow once a year. We're having a homecoming or coming home celebration this year on July 30th. I don't know if everybody knows, but the Hatsudamisco band left the Nipmuc Nation like a year and a half ago and decided to go back to our own selves. We didn't feel we should remain in that umbrella anymore. And so we're having a homecoming this month, end of this month. It's also powwow. We also grow food there. We also grow herbal plants for plant medicines. Their remains that we receive are normally put back there in a place where visitors can't really find or go to. So yeah, we use it as much as we can. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So Emily's question, yeah, repatriating artifacts is a little bit different. So if it's grave goods, if it's Ray, are you here?
I am.
Can you explain that? There's a difference between repatriating artifacts, repatriating remains and grave goods, yes?
Yeah, I would suggest that if they can, they come to the August 1st webinar, because it's kind of complicated, but there's two parts of the law. So human remains and associated funerary objects kind of go under one part of the law, and unassociated funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred objects go under another part of the law. So yeah, there's a different process. And also I had my hand raised earlier. I was going to suggest that, for tribal members who are interested, we do keep a list of, I guess you'd call them not really committees, but like different areas where people can volunteer, or help with different projects. And this is definitely an area where there's always a need for use. Everything, or a need for support. Everything that is done is pretty much volunteer basis by all tribal people, including the repatriation work. And it's, as you can imagine, it's not easy work. So it would require learning more about the law, and that can be done by just being involved in some of the repatriations or going through a training. But I'll be talking about the law in depth, kind of, it's like a NAGPRA 101 and a nuts and bolts about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in depth on August 1st.
Thank you. It is complicated. That's why I asked her. I can't answer that question. Any other questions, folks?
I have a question. I live in Columbus, Georgia. I would like to volunteer. So how would I get involved knowing I don't live close by?
Yeah, so thanks to COVID, we do a lot of stuff online. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. Like we're ordering a fire toilet today online for the renovation at the reservation. So there's lots of things that you can do online.
Now, would you have a list of things?
There is a list, and I don't know, but can you email me at info@nippy.org and I can send you the list. But yeah, there's a list, definitely.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions? So again, we have like 4 more of these. We're gonna have Ray on August 1st, talking about NAGPR and repatriation. We're gonna have Donna Spears from the Navajo Nation talking about cultural humility and how organizations can build relationships with Indigenous folks. It's a really good webinar. And then I think on August 29th, we're going to talk about Troy Phillips, who's the chair of the Commission on Indian Affairs, is going to be talking about land acknowledgements and things like that, and how organizations can work with us for those. And I think we're going to have a Nipmuc History Part 2 sometime in August as well. So thank you all for coming. And if there's no more questions, I guess we can sign off 10 minutes early. Bye, guys. Thank you for your time. Hedabotamish, and thank you for watching. All videos are available at the Hatsudamisco Nipmuc Band website at www.nipmucband.org. Hedabotamish.